And yeah, so welcome everyone in our first 2023 Learning Design Special Interest Group webinar. And we have today Vicky with us, and I will shortly introduce her. Learning Design Special Interest Group is part of ASCIILITE, which is Australasian Society for Computers in Learning and Teacher in Tertiary Education. And we have the link there if you want to join, and you can also join our group. So I'll start with a recognition of traditional owners of this land where we meet and study. So on behalf of Learning Design Special Interest Group, ASCIILITE, I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where we are meeting. I pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people attending this webinar or will be watching later on. Thanks everyone. If feel free to acknowledge from where you are in the chat. So just anybody who is new to this webinar, I just wanted to brief you about who we are. So ASCIILITE is a non-profit professional association for those who are engaged in educational use of technology in tertiary sector, so in higher education basically. ASCIILITE has many special interest groups, of which my colleagues, Associate Professor Leanne Nag-Onyo and Kate Haggett are part of, and we are co-leading this special interest group. We have a lot of exciting activities this year for all of you. But just before that, just brief about our learning design activities. So our special interest group is intended to be resource and network for academics and professionals who are responsible for or interested in learning design. Our focus is to provide a platform for members to come together and support collegial and collaborative environment. Now, last December, we had ASCIILITE conference, and we had a special interest group, our special interest group meeting, and we received a lot of interest as well as members who wanted to participate, and Vicky was one of them, who is today's speaker. So we want to include, and so if you are a member, you are part of that team's space where you can express your ideas and we can act on that. As I mentioned, we have, so you can, I put in a chat the link to where you can register for Learning Design Special Interest Group and be part of us. Okay, so as I mentioned, we have many interesting activities this year for you, and one of them is, apart from webinar, we are going to be doing learning design hackathons. And what that is and how is it going to be, I will let my colleague Leanne describe that for all of you.
Thanks, Kashmira, and a warm welcome to everybody here today. I'll be quite quick because we are very keen to hear from Vicky as well. So based on the feedback from our community, our special interest group, there was interest in doing some face-to-face activities as well, but also working together to work on hands-on activities where we can collectively work together and solve problems. So we've got a proposed plan for this year as well. All are welcome to attend these sessions. We put in some flagged activities and also hours and also month. This is all free and it's open as well. So we are focusing on the last few sessions, looking at a hybrid session hosted, having one hosted in Melbourne and also in Sydney as well. more information to come. We're very keen, very excited. We have Kate Mitchell, who's also here today, who will be co-presenting with us and working through this really exciting activity. So more on this soon, and also we're really excited to host this. But thank you so much, and I'll hand it over to Kashmira.
Thanks, Leanne. I think we have what we are expecting is just more of hands-on and people who want to seriously participate. But that information session will be separately launched, and you will get information. Let me just introduce today's speaker, who is our Vicky. And so Vicky is an educational designer in Faculty of Science and at University of Sydney. She said she stumbled into the curious world of educational design after pursuing Bachelor's of Communication and teaching part-time during the studies. Educational design has turned out to be the perfect career for her, and it allowed her to combine her skills in creativity, pedagogy, and all the activity contributing to the community that she wanted. Her experience as an educational designer spans several teams and 2 universities, and where she worked on postgraduate and student transition, workplace upskill, and interdisciplinary first-year studies and project-based learning in different contexts. She thinks education is one of the most exquisite experience a human can have. Perfectly, like, yes, agree with you. And but it can also be most devastating. And I want to hear more, Vicky, about why you say that. The psychological effect of learning has students' confidence and student-teachers relationship are topics that currently interest her. So without further ado, I hand over to you, Vicky.
Thanks, Kashmira. All right, I'm going to see if I can share screen. Window, here we go. Alrighty. Thanks very much, Kashmir, for that introduction. And basically, I'm going to talk to you about inclusive education because it's something I really care about. I've broken down my talk today into these 3 different sections. So I'm going to tell you about my journey to becoming an educational designer. And it's interesting that you've got some hackathons planned for the rest of the year, because I've kind of done that a little bit as well, coming up with some different scenarios where I'm hoping we can work together some educational inclusive education solutions to some scenarios. And then I'm just going to finish off by talking about a holistic design philosophy. So I was born with Marfan syndrome. And if you don't know what Marfan syndrome is, it's a connective tissue disorder, which basically means that everything in my body was super, super stretchy and bendy. And it affected my body in lots of different ways. But the way that it mainly affected me was when I was born, was it meant that my lenses in my eyes were dislocated, which meant that I was legally blind. Now, I know legally blind is a bit of a difficult thing for people to understand and imagine what that could actually mean. So I've given you a bit of an example of what things looked like for me. So it was really difficult for me to see people's facial expressions and their faces. Sometimes 2 people ended up looking like 1 person. Everything was a bit sort of dark and blurry. And if there wasn't enough contrast, everything just kind of blended and blurred together. So this is sort of what my level of vision was like when I was born. So this is what school looked like for me when I was younger. I couldn't see the whiteboard that people were writing on. I could read some text as long as I used magnifiers and had it up very, very close. Then I could have some vision to be able to read. But for most of the time, this is sort of what my world looked like. And then when I was 10, my school asked me to sit an exam for the SMART class. Now that I'm an educational designer, I'm sure it was probably called something else. It was probably called, enrichment learning or accelerated curriculum. But I was 10, so I only remember it being called the SMART class. And basically what we did is we everyone in the year sat this exam, and the students who got the top 15 marks got put into a class together. And we were supposed to be taught a more advanced curriculum, more, I guess, critical thinking skills as opposed to just rote learning activities. So this was supposed to be really, really good, except the teacher who led that class had a belief that I shouldn't have been in that class because I was someone who couldn't see. And because it was a competitive position, she kind of believed that I was taking up a spot for someone who could see. And she believed that there was no point in me getting access to this advanced education because I was only ever going to grow up to be on the dole anyways. So she really didn't want me to be there. She excluded me from a lot of the extracurricular activities like debating and Tournament of the Minds and various art classes that we were supposed to be engaging in as part of that class, but she just excluded me from them. So similarly, at this age, I was a very competitive swimmer. I loved my swimming. I didn't use any assistive devices when I was swimming. Maybe that's why I liked it so much. I just swam, basically. And I ended up getting so good at swimming that I became the fastest girl in my year group and in my area. This upset a couple of parents because, once again, these are competitive positions, and in their view, I was taking up a space that their child could have had if I was to compete in the para class. But I sort of thought, well, there's no point in me competing in the para class because I'm not using any assistive devices to swim. So why can't I just compete in the regular class with everybody else? So they were very unhappy with me, but I kept on competing in the regular class and winning the races as well. But basically, all of these negative experiences that I had in primary school meant that when I went to high school, I convinced my parents that we weren't going to tell anyone that I couldn't see. So I don't know how I managed to convince them to do this, but we didn't tell any of the teachers that I had a disability. A couple of my friends knew who had been to primary school with me, but that's it. So basically, the way that I learned in high school was I pretended to take notes so that I wouldn't get caught. But I just listened to what the teachers were saying, and I developed this really good auditory memory for all of my classes. And I did okay. I got B's and C's in most of my classes, a couple of A's in classes where I was naturally gifted. Terrible at geography because it doesn't matter how good you are at listening and remembering. It's very, very hard to listen to someone talking about a map and all of those other kind of visual diagrams and things I really struggled with. But I never struggled enough that I failed anything. And I think that's maybe why none of the teachers ever caught on that I couldn't see. None of them ever intervened. And it's probably because I wasn't an at-risk student, so I never drew any attention to myself in that way. Then when I was 16, I had eye surgery, which improved my vision drastically. So basically they replaced my lenses with new lenses, which meant I was now able to see the world, which was really, really exciting for me. I got to see new shades of blue that I've never seen before, which was one of the best things ever about that time. And my marks just skyrocketed. They immediately got a lot better. I was getting, A's in everything. And I think it's really important for us to acknowledge that my intelligence didn't change. My brain was exactly the same. The only difference was that now I could see the kind of learning resources that everybody else could see. So I was able to perform a lot better in my assessment tasks. So I got my ATAR in the 90s, went off to university, had to move to Sydney from Port Macquarie. So quite a big move, country girl in the big city, which was, supposed to be very exciting. But like I said, Marfan syndrome is a genetic condition. So while my eyes were getting better, that was affecting my body in other ways. So my heart became a lot stretchier, my joints became a lot stretchier, which meant it was really, really difficult for me to move around. So my experience at university was a lot of hospital visits, a lot of trialing different medications. And in those days, lectures weren't recorded. So I spent a lot of time just at home on my own, reading journal articles, trying to self-educate myself to pass my assessments. So during this time, I kind of went into a bit of a mental health slump, and I developed this view of myself as someone who is a fourth class citizen, like a fourth or fifth class citizen. I remember hearing people talk about being a second class citizen and looking at them and being like, oh, like I wish I could be a second class citizen. That sounds amazing. If I could only dream to be that. Because everyone throughout my whole life had just sort of had this very low expectation of what I should be and what I should do. And if I wasn't given access to something because I wasn't failing, I was just kind of like an average student, there was no need for them to intervene. And this is kind of the narrative that I've been told my whole life. So that was my experience of education. So basically, there are 3 things I want you to write down from my story. The first one is that disability is a community issue. I really don't want you to think about disability in an us and them mentality, because disability is something that can be acquired throughout your lifetime. And just because you don't have a disability now doesn't mean that you won't have one in the future. So I don't want you to think about disability as a minority issue. It is a majority issue. It is something that concerns you. It is your problem. And because the older that you get, the more likely you are to acquire a disability. So please, please, please think about disability as something that is going to affect all of us, because it does. The second thing is that disability is not a static thing, okay? It can change over time. Your symptoms can fluctuate and change. Like my story, I was born blind. I'm not blind anymore. I was a competitive athlete. And then I had this university experience where I was struggling to just walk to class. So please don't think about disability as something that is just a set thing. It can change person to person, day to day, all of the time. The third thing is that disability discrimination is really, really influenced by our attitudes. I think my story is a really good example of that, because the discrimination that I faced wasn't necessarily about people physically excluding me. It wasn't like there weren't ramps or things like that, like physical barriers. A lot of the barriers I was facing was actually people's thoughts. So people thinking that I was taking up space for someone else, that I didn't deserve to be there. And I kind of internalized that narrative as well, and ended up having a bit of a negative self-narrative because of those different attitudes. So as important as it is for us to talk about assistive technologies and practical things that we can do to make people with disabilities more included in our society, I think the most important thing that drives all of that is actually the way that we think about people with disabilities and the way that we think about ourselves. So those are my 3 key takeaways. I hope you've written them down or committed them to memory. And it's probably no surprise to you that the reason I became an educational designer is because I wanted to make education more inclusive. I spent so much of my time being excluded from education. That's the reason that I became an educational designer, is to make it sure that other people have the chance to learn in ways that I didn't. So that's my journey. We're going to move on to thinking about what is inclusive education. And you might have some ideas of what inclusive education means to you, or maybe some examples that you've used in your practice as an educational designer. I want you to maybe think about what those are, and I'm going to share some different ideas with you as well. It's a really hot topic at the moment. The UN has made it one of the Sustainability Goal 4. One of the targets under Sustainability Goal 4. So Goal 4 is all about giving people equal access to education. And the UN has named that one of the targets to achieving that is helping people who are in vulnerable groups, of which they identify people with disabilities as part of that vulnerable group, getting equal access to all levels of education. The New South Wales Department of Education defines inclusive education as students with disabilities being welcomed to their school to support and supported to reach their full potential. So that's an interesting definition of what inclusive education means. And I've just made a little word cloud of some of the different academic literature, which is talking about inclusive education. You can see UDL is up there, bright and big. Also, we've got things about students, design, we've got needs as well, outcomes. So these are some of the different ideas of what people are saying inclusive education is. And maybe these are some of the ideas that you had in your head or are thinking about what inclusive education is. So what I want us to do is actually start thinking about what inclusive education means for teachers. So this is something I started thinking about when I became the co-chair of the University of Sydney's Disability at Work network. So we're a staff network of people with disabilities who work at the university. And of course, some of those people are teachers. And so some of the things that we've been talking about are the different barriers and issues that teachers with disabilities are facing to complete their job. So what I want us to do is work through a couple of different scenarios, and I want us to put our design brains together and try and think of some ways that we can make the education more inclusive for the teacher. And I should note these are absolutely hypothetical scenarios. I didn't want to use any of the real scenarios I have from Dawn because I just wanted to protect people's identities and anonymity. So these are absolutely made up, and which also means there's no correct answer. So please be as creative as you like, and we'll jump into them. So our first one is a teacher is not confident teaching about patient care. So this could be maybe in a medical sciences degree where the teacher is teaching to the curriculum about patient care, but they're not really confident. They don't really know how to do that. So what are some design ideas we could use to help out this teacher? I'll give you a little moment to have a think. So I'm going to share some of the design ideas I came up with to help out this scenario. So we could get a person with a disability to come into the classroom and share their lived experience of disability. So I think this is a really great idea because it takes all of the pressure away from the teacher and moves the knowledge that's being shared to a really accurate source. It's the actual patients talking about what patient care means for them with their particular disabilities. You could even ask that person with a disability, what is your criteria for good patient care? What's your rubric for that? And then you could turn it into an assessment and actually assess the students to that person with lived experience's standard of what good patient care means. So this could be some possible outcomes for these designs is that the students get to learn from different perspectives, bringing people with lived experience of disability into the classroom. It's not something new. We've kind of already been doing it when we bring industry experts into the classroom. It's just another version of expertise that we're drawing on. So we're training our students to graduate as more inclusive citizens and being exposed to different kinds of people. And then we've also significantly reduced that teacher anxiety who was really nervous about teaching about patient care. So that's one scenario. Our next one is we have a class of 300 students and there's only one teacher allocated to do all of the marking. So 300 students, one person. What design ideas do we have to help this teacher out? We'll have a little think. So some solutions I came up with was we could use a screen reader to read the submissions from the students. So screen readers are really, really great for speeding up long reading tasks. They're kind of like if you've watched those videos on 2x speed, you can do that with a screen reader as well. You can increase the speed that it reads out text to you. And the more proficient you are at using screen reader, the better you are at actually understanding that really, really fastly read text from the screen reader. And then the marker could even provide oral feedback to the students to save them typing out all of their feedback on their computer. They can just record oral feedback and send it to the students that they're marking. So some possible outcomes of this, we've already talked about reducing the marking time, speeding it up a lot. Also potentially more personal feeling feedback for the students. So they're actually hearing their teacher's human voice giving them feedback and all of the nuances of the tone of their voice that come through rather than just written text. So there's no need for the teacher to read through all of those 300 submissions. They can just listen to them. And I really like this last one where the students are learning how to format their documents in an accessible way. And I think this is really, really great, because we already ask our students all of the time to format their documents in different referencing styles. So it's nothing new, but all we're asking them to do is also format them in an accessible way. And this is a really great teaching moment for the students to learn how to become those inclusive citizens when they graduate, because now they're graduating knowing how to create accessible documents, which is more and more becoming a part of everybody's workflow when they're in the workforce. So our last scenario, we have a teacher who has a medical emergency and cannot write the script in time for filming. So what can we do to kind of help this teacher out? So the idea I came up with is, why don't we use a language AI like ChatGPT to draft a version of the script for them? So we could even take different learning resources that we already have written by that teacher and populate it into the language model, and just ask the AI to write us a 300-word draft script introducing the topic. We could then send this draft script to the teacher and ask them to edit it before delivering to camera. So I know this is like a little bit novel, but the values that I see, the value adds I see of this particular design intervention is we could potentially speed up the production of videos, and we could maybe even get a few more reviews of the script, because I don't know if many of you have done video recording for educational videos before, but they're often very, very time pressured. We don't always get enough time to review those scripts very often. The academics are normally very time poor. So I think if you had a draft script written by an AI, maybe we would have a little bit more opportunity to review it critically, both as educational designers and as the academic, and maybe we even get a better script overall at the end. So there are a couple of scenarios. I'm just going to finish up. Oh, sorry. Nope. So back to my the definitions of disability that I shared from my story. We know that disability is a community issue, is non-static, and it is influenced by attitudes. But after looking at these scenarios, I hope that we can understand that teacher inclusion in education is co-designed, it's flexible, it's using different kinds of technologies to innovate solutions so that teachers are also included in the education process, not just students as well. So those are our scenarios. Now I'm going to move on to talking about the design philosophy I use for creating inclusive education. So this is it. It's basically that students do their best learning when teachers do their best teaching. So this is something that I really, really strongly believe, because if you have a student who is having a hard time, the teacher picks up on it, and then the teacher has a bit of a hard time, and then they're not able to do the best teaching that they otherwise would have. And the teacher and the student are kind of in this like cyclical feedback loop with each other, where they both react to what the other one is doing. So I think when we were looking earlier about inclusive education sort of definitions and those ideas around student experience, engagement, UDL, a lot of those are looking at the student perspective and trying to make sure that they are doing their best learning. And a lot of the solutions that are coming out around students to do their best learning are looking at teachers and saying, teachers, you need to do this or not do this. And I think that that has been very, very helpful, for moving inclusive education ideas along. But I think that that has had its place in history, and we should maybe leave it there for now, because the problem with when we look at student engagement and we say, teachers, you need to do this or not do this in order for the students to learn better, is that we're placing a lot of restrictions on the teacher. And sometimes it means that the teacher actually isn't able to participate in the teaching anymore. So if you think about the previous slide where I was talking about inclusive education for teachers is flexible, we need to be flexible in the way that we talk about our recommendations to teachers as well as our recommendations for students. So What I do as an educational designer is I try to look at the things that the teacher is really, really good at. So maybe I have a teacher who is really good at giving oral lectures and really good at engaging industry and really good at coming up with some imaginary, hypothetical, what-if scenarios. What I don't want to do as an educational designer is go in and say, stop doing the oral lectures and start doing like active learning seminars. I don't want to do that if I'm thinking about inclusive education, because the teacher is really, really, really good at oral lectures. They might not be good at delivering active learning seminars. So what I try to do instead is say, you keep doing that. That's wonderful. Anything I could do to help you continue doing that is a plus. And then as a designer, I try to look at if the current model of teaching is creating any gaps for the student in their learning. And then as a designer, I try to fill those in different ways. So for feedback, I could use technology like the SRES to provide automatic feedback. I could use the screen reader example that I gave earlier, where we're speeding up the marking process so it's not such a high workload for the teacher. We could introduce a couple of social learning elements, and I could get on Canvas and kind of collate some different resources and present them nicely and in a logical format for the student. So the teacher still gets to do the things that they're really good at. I've not placed any barriers on their teaching that might exclude them from being able to teach, but then I've also bridged the gap so that the students also are included in the learning and have all of their needs fulfilled as well. So this is what I mean by a holistic learning design model. It's about taking a step back and making sure that both the teacher and the student's needs are being met and fulfilled in the learning process. So I hope you all came to this session already thinking that we all deserve to learn, but I hope you also leave this session by thinking about that we all deserve to teach. Our world is shaped by design, because sort of everything around us has been designed by someone at some point, but in the end, designs are just decisions. So what decisions can you make to make education more inclusive? So that's the end from me.
Oh, please put your hands together for Vicky Ann. And if you want to put an emoji or a comment in the chat, please go right ahead and do that. And Vicky Ann, really great timing, because now we've got a lot of time to ask all kinds of questions, right?
Oh, that'd be great. It was very quick.
So thank you. You know, that was a wonderful presentation. And normally we have a bit of a standing item on our presentations where we ask about designing for inclusivity and diversity. But I'm not going to ask a question about that, because I think it would be kind of pointless, since that was a real thrust for all of your presentation. So what I'd like to do is throw it open to the floor. So if you're there and you would like to ask Vicky Ann a question, please don't hesitate to either put it in the chat window, or if you're brave enough and you want to switch on your microphone and ask it, you know, go right ahead, because we've got great time, and it'd be really interesting to hear your thoughts and your comments and your questions. And Vicky Ann, make sure you read the chats. There's lots of lovely comments.
I've not used to collaborate before, so I'm sorry everyone who was chatting while I was talking. I'm only just looking at them now, but thank you.
Yeah. All right. I'm just going to give people a little bit of thinking time. I do have some questions of my own that I want to ask, but I always like to give our members a chance to ask the questions first. Susan, do you want to jump in?
Yes, can you hear me?
Loud and clear. Go right ahead.
I'm an educational designer at the University of Tasmania, and the problem we have with universal design at the moment is that it's still seen as a nice to have rather than a must have. So, you know, people acknowledge that it's important, but academics aren't really actively, you know, taking approaches to make sure that the material that they're producing is, you know, accessible to everybody. So I wondered if you had any strategies for making it seen as a must-have. I know you said earlier that you have a presence at, I think, a high-level committee or something like that at your organisation, which I think is a great step. But I guess how do we get it into the must-have category, because it's really important.
Yeah, and I think that's a really great question, and it's something that I've come across a lot as well, Susan, where people sometimes believe in inclusive education, but they might think that it's not their job or not their responsibility to necessarily do the work to make that happen. And I think one of the takeaways that I wrote down from my story is that disability is a community issue, and it's a community issue because it affects everyone and all of us. So I really believe that disability inclusion is a right as well as a responsibility of each and every one of us. So that's, first of all, my advice, I guess, is to try and champion, that it is a community issue and it's not just this small minority group of people with disabilities who need UDL. And that's also not sort of, I guess, the purpose of universal design for learning. Universal design for learning is that it's supposed to be something that is beneficial to everyone, not just people with disabilities. You might also want to look at the legal requirements that are placed on universities to offer inclusive education. Sometimes that can encourage people to think a little bit more actively about the changes that they can make. But the Disability at Work network that I'm a part of the work that we've been doing is encouraging people with disabilities to share their stories like I've shared mine, because it really encourages people to think more actively about the changes that they can make in their teaching to make education more inclusive.
Thank you. That was great.
Sorry, Susan. Do you want to follow up?
I was just saying thank you. No, that was a good answer. Thank you.
All right, yeah. Lyndon asked a very similar question. How do you advocate for prioritising UDL and inclusive practice? And I think you've kind of answered it, but I'll just ask you, Vicky Ann, do you want to add anything to that, or are you happy to move on to another question?
Sorry, could you repeat the question for me?
Oh, sorry. So this was from Lyndon, and he said, my question is similar. How do you advocate for prioritising UDL and inclusive practice?
I think I probably tend to advocate more for lived experience over UDL. I think that lived experience is sort of more of a quick win. UDL is sort of I think they're both important and both have a role to play in creating inclusive education. But finding someone with a disability and getting them to share their ideas in your curriculum, or even just asking students to submit their documents in an accessible format, those are things that you can do very, very quickly, whereas UDL is something that affects the design of the whole course and can be a little bit more time consuming. So personally, I tend to go down the lived experience route first. And thankfully with the Dawn network, we have quite a few staff members who we can draw upon for that experience. And it might be different in your universities where you work, but yeah, so that would be my advice, is to advocate for lived experience first and then UDL second.
Yeah. I really like the practical nature of the advice you're giving, Vicky Ann. And just want to draw out a few other comments that kind of support that. Kate mentioned that time-saving perspective for academics is really important, because academics are busy. Well, we're all busy people, right? So anything we can do for that is really important. And Colin mentioned that universities react most quickly when something is seen as a threat, financial, reputational, legal, which I think is an interesting comment to make. But I'm going to throw it over to David. David, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I do, Keith. Sorry, I was having trouble sharing my video. Thanks so much for organising this, Keith, and thanks, Vicky, so much for your presentation. It's really, really fantastic. And just what you said about UDL just then versus lived experience, like triple thumbs up that. That's really fantastic. My question though is, I guess it's about the some of the things you were talking about and thinking about teachers in higher education, the high performance environment that they're working in. I've personally had to support. I'm a learning designer at UTS, and supporting academics who are going through what is clearly an experience of that non-static disability. It's something that's happening for a short period of time, or over several months, but not really getting the recognition that that's actually what they're going through. It's sort of, I guess it's more about the environment that they're in, and it feels really hard for them to in an environment where their disability isn't really acknowledged, or where even if it is acknowledged, they still feel that pressure to be very high performing and really be doing everything themselves and trying to manage, their subjects completely. How they can support students experiencing disability at the same time is really challenging. I guess it's more of a comment than a question, but sorry.
No, I think it's a really, really important comment to make, is because, like a lot of the conversation we've been having in the past couple of years is making education more inclusive to students, and we haven't been thinking about the teachers who are facilitating that inclusion and whether they're actually included in the process as well. And I think you've kind of touched on this idea of when disabilities are invisible, it's a lot more difficult to explain them to people and to get things like workplace adjustments and to make your workload a little bit easier. And like that story is really similar to me, where no one, when I was in high school and at university, no one offered me any assistance, and I also didn't ask for it because I wasn't failing. I was sort of competent enough that I could still perform relatively well, but I kind of look back at that now, and I think, oh, if I had access to all of the learning resources, would I have been, amazing, or what difference would that have made on my performance? So I think some of the things that we can do as educational designers is look at those units where there are teachers who have different kinds of needs, or sort of different fluctuating needs, and try and design those away. So I kind of gave a few examples in those scenarios, but maybe we can think about some other examples that are specific to the units that this teacher is working on. But I think the way that you kind of win them over and get them on side with what you're trying to do is to not come at it from you're doing something wrong as the teacher. It's as the educational designer, you're saying, okay, what things are you doing well? Keep doing those. We can use technology and we can use design to do everything else. Like, technology is getting so advanced now. We don't need teachers to be good at everything. We just need them to be good at the things they're good at.
Love it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, a lot of people agreeing with you in the chat window there. Yeah, really interesting. Thank you for sharing that. Kate Mitchell's got a bit more of a practical question. She said, are there some good resources or details around the legal requirements? Because we get asked this a lot, and there is no good university policy here. So what are your go-to kind of resources in that space, Vicky Ann?
Can I just ask as a follow-up, are legal requirements for the student access or the teacher access? Oh, I can say for both. So for so for the students' access to education, you probably want to be looking at the education standards that were written in around 2005. Okay, student access, great. So just Google it's disability inclusion education standards 2005, and that is the official legal requirement of what educational institutions are supposed to do for students with disabilities. I think it's quite a long document, and you can find easy read versions of it or summarized versions, but I think one of the things that I took note of when I was reading it is that it actually talks about students with disabilities and students without disabilities, and it basically, every single line that it says, and it says this like 27 times, but in different contexts, it says students with disabilities should be able to access classes, clubs, societies, assessments, etc., on the same basis as people without disability. And it uses that phrase multiple times, on the same basis. So in your practice, the best advice I can give you is to look at the person, the student who doesn't have a disability, and what kind of access do they have? Are they spending a lot of effort trying to find their resources? Are they spending a lot of time? If they're not, then your student with a disability shouldn't be spending a lot of time trying to find those same resources. So I hope that helps.
Yeah. Well, and there's some people sharing some links in the chat window as well. I just wanted to share something that I saw happen at my university. A colleague of mine called Katie Duncan. She did some work around accessibility for students. And what she did, and it was, you know, I think it won awards. It certainly deserved to win awards. But she co-designed these educational resources for teaching staff, for academic staff, with the students in question. You know, so there was a student who had vision impairment and a student who had mobility issues and all those kinds of things. And they were the ones who explained what and how they use different technology and the kinds of things they required in order to be able to access the course. And I just thought, you know, that hearing from the students themselves about that was a really powerful way of sharing, you know, what we all should be doing, you know, without a second thought. Yeah, I thought that was a good idea. And if you're in the room and you want to share, I did win awards. There you go. Fantastic. And I think David's just shared a link to it as well. Thank you for that, David. But if you're in the room and you might not want to ask a question of Vicky Ann, but you want to share a similar example, so maybe something you've designed or something that you've seen designed and you thought that was really good, you know, please, we'd love to hear it as well. You know, we can kind of move away from an interrogation of Vicky Ann and more towards a bit of a community of practice here, if you like. Yeah. And I can see Andrew in the chat window has just mentioned his own. He shares his own lived experience with audio issues, which I think is yeah. It's I think you raise a really good point, Andrew. Do you want to say anything further about that? You know, how much do you talk about yourself? I mean, Vicky Ann's been very honest with us. Yeah.
I don't talk about it much. I mean, it's just mentioning it. Because what you're trying to do is I find that when I'm working with academics, which I've done for about 30 odd years, it's a matter of giving them little nudges or assistances to help point them in the right direction, and just getting them thinking about things, because this sort of stuff comes down to like ethical, moral issues. Do I help these people? Should I be helping these people? And how could I help these people? And so if they have an example of, you know, what their practice is doing to someone, like, you know, can't hear it or something, then I think it just helps them starting to tick over here. So that's all I was trying to say. I don't do it much.
Yeah. No, good point. Yeah. Little nudges. People like that idea. Yeah. And I think that's what you mentioned, Vicky Ann, with kind of small wins as well, didn't you? Yeah.
Yeah. I think the fastest, it's sort of a double-edged sword, really, because I think the fastest way that we can change people's attitudes to disabilities, to share stories from people who have disabilities. But if you're the person with the disability, it's really risky for you to do that, right? You're potentially putting yourself out there and could then be excluded or rejected by the people that you're telling your story to. So I think that's the fastest way forward. But you've also, if you're the person, you've got to sort of do a bit of a risk assessment and see whether or not it's going to be safe for you.
Yeah. And certainly not advocating people sharing things that they don't feel comfortable sharing. Yeah, no, good point. Thank you for sharing that. Something that frustrates me, and I think this cuts to the heart, and this was going to be my question to you. You know, one of the things that frustrates me in my learning design role, I'm more of an academic now, but one of my roles is I'm a responsible academic officer. So I often have to deal with you know, student complaints or concerns about something. And what I find is it's not often it's not all. Sometimes it is, but it's not often the academic that's the problem. I haven't really met very many academics that say, I don't care that you have a hearing impairment or you use a screen reader. They generally want to help as much as they can. But the thing that does frustrate me is the amount of administrivia that students seeking assistance require in order to get what they deserve, what we should have in any situation. So I was going to ask you, Vicky, do you have any experience in kind of minimizing that kind of administrative burden on students with requirements or things like that?
I think yeah, this is definitely a big issue, and it's sort of maybe it's one of the reasons why, I mean, my solution as to it as a person with a disability was just to not tell anyone. So I don't think that's necessarily a solution everyone should go forward with, but I think it's also something that we should acknowledge that a lot of people with disabilities do because the administrative burden is so high. They just don't tell anyone, and they either kind of slip under the radar and don't do particularly well and don't do particularly badly and no one notices, or they fail. And I think it's important that we know that I think it's 14% of people with disabilities have a bachelor's degree, and it's like 30% of people without disabilities do. So it's quite a significant difference. And I wonder whether or not that's because people with disabilities are either so excluded that they don't get the chance to do university, or whether there are people graduating who have disabilities but just aren't telling anyone about them. So that's probably where we would be looking more towards universal design for learning, is so that students don't have to apply for accommodations or special considerations.
Yeah, exactly. Good design is
Yeah,
good for everyone and
same
essential
idea as
for
me.
some. Yeah. All right. Well, I'm just looking at the time, and we're losing a few people. I mean, as we move back into a kind of hybrid world of face-to-face and online events, I always like to give people a little bit of time to rush to the next building if they've got to do that. But if you're still in the room, I would really appreciate you just putting your hands together one more time to thank Vicky and for all of her sharing and her presentation. I thought it was pretty good.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Brilliant. And for everyone else, make sure you stay tuned to the Learning Design SIG. We've got lots and lots of events, including more webinars like this one coming up next month. But I'm really looking forward to the big hackathons. They are going to be very exciting. All right, so we will say goodbye on behalf of Kashmira, Leanne, and myself. Thank you for coming, and we'll see you next time. Thank you, Vicky Ann.
Thank you. Bye. I want to read through the chat.